everyone, and welcome to Ask the Advocate Live. I'm Miss Melissa Minnick, and tonight is your chance to have your questions about all things special education and dyslexia answered by our professional advocate, certified dyslexia advocate, Lorraine Hightower. We're going to talk to Lorraine in a second, but let's go over a few things for how tonight's going to go. So we would like to have this be an interactive and lively conversation between you guys and us. So please feel free to comment in the comments section. Tell us your thoughts and definitely ask Lorraine your questions about special education and dyslexia. Introduce yourself. Let us know where you're from. We would love to get to know you better. And I also want to take a second to thank the people that sent questions beforehand. We are going to address those questions. We're going to add those into the questions that we are asked live, and we'll make sure we cover those. So keep watching.
Yes.
Lorraine, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Of course. Yes. You know, it is, as we talk about the month of October, is all things dyslexia. So it's my pleasure to be here.
Great. So Lorraine, for the people who are watching that may not know you yet, could you tell us a little bit about who you are and your story and why you're so passionate about what you do?
Yes, absolutely. And first of all, thank you to those who are joining us live. As Melissa said, I am a certified dyslexia advocate and consultant, and I really serve parents who have children with dyslexia or they suspect their children have dyslexia in the public school system. So most of the kids that we work with are grades K through 11, I will say. And we help those parents through every stage of the special education process. So whether it's the initial referral, because we believe they should have special education services and supports, through eligibility, through actually crafting an appropriate and effective educational plan, which could look like an IEP or a 504 if our audience is familiar with those terms. And then, of course, sometimes when we hit a bump in the road, we help with dispute resolution, strategies and actions as well. And you asked, I think, Melissa, about why I am so passionate about this work. Yes. And I really am, because I've not only trained as a specialist in this area, but I am the proud mom of an almost 18-year-old who has severe and profound dyslexia, as well as ADHD and dysgraphia, which is a handwriting disability. So through his entire public education career, he's had these learning differences, and he was not identified early. He was missed, unfortunately. We live in Virginia, and we did not have, and we still, questionable, have appropriate screening measures. So he kind of just moved on up, socially promoted throughout the grades. And unfortunately, when he was in middle school, he really hit a social and emotional wall. And that took quite a toll on our family. So through my own experience as a mom and as a professional, we finally got him what he needed, and he's thriving in his senior year of high school and excited about his future. But I know the pain, the frustration, the fear that parents go through when they're trying to advocate on their own. So that's why we formed our company, and we're in our 5th September. So it's exciting.
It is exciting. And I love that it comes from a natural place for you. You know, that you have been through all of the things that these parents have gone through, and you've educated yourself and done the training. And thank you for sharing what you've learned and what you've gone through with everyone else.
Yes. So, and Melissa, I want to turn things on you for a second, because it's such a joy to have you on our team, and maybe just tell everybody a little bit about your background and why you're here.
Yeah, sure. So I was a teacher. I've been in education for the last 20 years. I taught in Maryland and did some work in Virginia as well. And I'll tell you, when I knew it was time to get out of the classroom, this job was the perfect fit for me, because I have been in the school system. I've seen some of the struggles of the special education system. I've seen teachers who, you know, have the best of intentions for the students, but lack, especially when I was teaching, lacked a lot of the education and the training, especially around dyslexia. So it feels good for me to be here and a part of this company and sharing this information with parents, but also with teachers and everybody, so that, you know, it's Dyslexia Awareness Month. And one of the things that we've been posting about on social media and talking about in our newsletters is think dyslexia. You know, and I didn't have enough training when I was teaching to really know to think dyslexia.
Exactly.
You know, if your child is struggling with reading and spelling, maybe it's this. you know?
Right. And that's a good message for parents and teachers. So let's jump into our parent questions. I
Yes.
love that people sent them to us right up to a few minutes ago. So thank you.
Yes, I know. Thank you to everyone for doing that. So, you mentioned October is Dyslexia Awareness Month. So, I would love to jump in with a couple of the questions that were sent to us regarding dyslexia. So, we'll get started there. And of course, anyone who is here with us live, please feel free to comment your questions and I will ask those to Lorraine as well. So, our first question says, my child has an IEP for ADHD, but I think he has dyslexia as well. How do I ask for help with dyslexia at the next IEP meeting?
Okay, so that is, I'll just say, a really good question and something that not everybody is aware of, in the sense that I would say 30%, I'm going to say, sometimes they say it's as high as 50%, but 30% of people with dyslexia also have ADHD, and many parents don't realize that. And what I see as an advocate is that oftentimes kids are identified with other health impairment, which is the category ADHD kind of lives in under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, when they might have ADHD, but the more profound disability is dyslexia. So this is a really good question. And I would say to that parent, first of all, if anything changes for your child and they have an IEP, you should reconvene the IEP team sooner rather than later, is what we always say, and share your concerns. Explain why you believe your child has dyslexia, or potentially challenges with reading and spelling and writing.
That's such a great point, because I think that a lot of times, Lorraine, parents don't realize that they can call an IEP meeting at any time.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. It's kind of on the document. It says your annual IEP meeting, which unfortunately leads parents to think I can only do this once a year. So I would have that parent reconvene the IEP team, tell them about your concerns. I imagine you're either seeing something with your child at home, or you're getting certain school district assessments or test scores, or you're seeing their writing that has you wondering why they're not performing in your mind up to expectations. And know that you can ask the district to do additional evaluations for a new category or a new classification of suspected disability. So absolutely, parents can share their concerns, ask for additional assessments. We often say, do not wait, and get the data that you need to make an informed decision. And we don't recommend that teams guess whether or not a child does have a specific learning disability along with their ADHD. We think that should be formally looked at.
Does the parent need to seek like a separate IEP for specific learning disability?
No. So in this case, let's just say in that example, they would get additional assessments, and they would be back at the eligibility table considering an additional classification under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So they might have as their primary disability category other health impairment, but they'd be considering a secondary eligibility classification of specific learning disability, which is where dyslexia kind of lives on those classification designations, if you will.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lorraine.
Yeah, so I hope that helps that parent. And if that parent is here, they can ask a follow-up question if I've left anything out.
That would be great. And so feel free to pipe in if you are here. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and get to a second question that was sent to us. It says, what do you suggest for a child who has an IEP and is receiving OG style small group 3 times a week? And maybe you can explain what that means. OG style small group 3 times a week, but doesn't seem to be progressing much, if at all, in reading, writing, and spelling.
Okay, so that is a situation that sounds like the student has an IEP. They've been found eligible for specialized intervention, so specially designed instruction. When I hear the words OG 3 times a week, that is an Orton-Gillingham approach that is being used with that student to teach them how to improve their literacy skills, which include reading, spelling, and obviously written expression. So if that parent is saying, my child's been in this group, small group, and I'm not seeing any progress, what do I do? A couple of questions come to mind for me. I would want to know, how long have they been receiving that intervention? Because it will take approximately 6 to 8 weeks to see any kind of progress, movement with any new intervention. And then I would also be asking, what is the makeup of the group? And obviously, when we ask this as parents, we're told, well, you can't have confidential information or identifiable information about the other students, but that's not what I'm thinking. I'm thinking more, are all of the students in that group at about the same tier of need, meaning they all have the same deficits, kind of in the same range. I would also want to know the intensity of the intervention. So depending upon the severity of the student's achievement gap, this intervention should be frequent and intense. So maybe it should be, 5 times a week and not 3 times a week in order to make progress. And then lastly, I would be considering the training of the person providing the intervention. And I know that is kind of a hot topic in our public schools because many parents tell us that they're told, well, they just have to be a licensed special education teacher. And while that is technically true, there are many precedents that say that methodology has to be considered for students who require a certain methodology. So when we're talking about a student who has dyslexia, and we know that, we need to make sure the teacher is trained to provide an intervention like OG that is effective, evidence-based to be effective for kids with dyslexia. So, Melissa, did you freeze on us? There you are. You looked like you froze for a second.
I think I did freeze for a second. Sorry about that.
But that's really what I would say to that mom. Consider all of those factors. How long has the intervention been in place? Size of the group. Is the group homogeneous in nature? Intensity of instruction. Maybe it needs to be increased. Maybe the group size needs to be downsized. So there's not 5 kids, there's 3 kids. One, your daughter might be the only one. And then training. And also, I have to say, Melissa, we talk a lot about fidelity in a lot of our trainings, making sure that the intervention is being delivered with fidelity as it wasn't intended to be done. And when we're talking about OG, that is a multisensory approach that includes, phonemic awareness, decoding, encoding, which is spelling. It's really a robust lesson plan. It shouldn't just be little bits and pieces. So I hope that's helpful to that parent.
How does a parent find out if what they're being presented or what their child is being given, it does have fidelity? Do they Google something or, how do they know?
Yes. Well, definitely it all starts as a conversation. It can happen either at the IEP table or it can happen through a parent-teacher conference with the reading specialist or the special education teacher who's delivering that instruction. In some school districts, they use what are often referred to as packaged programs, right? Many people have heard of Wilson or Linda Mood Bell or Spire. Those are what I call packaged OG programs. And they actually have implementation guidelines that tell teachers to implement this with fidelity. This is how the instruction should be provided. So you hope that that's happening, but it's certainly okay to ask about it. Ask,
Great.
How is my child's reading intervention or specially designed literacy instruction being implemented? And is this in accordance with the implementation protocols from the publisher of the program? Now, other school districts use more of an eclectic approach, and that could be problematic. So that's where you have to peel back the layers and figure out, well, what is your approach and how much time is my child being exposed to this? And what does the lesson plan look like? And how are you progress monitoring? And what is kind of the expected pace of progress that I can look for in this school year?
Those are great questions to ask. Thank you.
Of course.
Michael has a question. He's with us live tonight. He says, my son has dyslexia and he is on an IEP. Previous IEPs used his dyslexia to qualify him for an IEP. But in last year's IEP, they put him under OHI. Is this reasonable?
So is it reasonable? I don't know how to answer, is it reasonable, Michael, but thank you for being here. Here's what I'm going to say. The criteria is different for the 2 classifications, right? So I guess as I'm saying that, you wouldn't find a student who has dyslexia eligible under other health impairment. You'd find them eligible under specific learning disability. At the same time, there's a lot of children who have other health impairment as their eligibility classification, but then as part of looking at their overall learning profile, we know that they also have dyslexia. Where the differential comes in my mind, is how severe is the dyslexia, right? So you could have a child with other health impairment who has mild dyslexia, maybe they're well remediated and the IEP team needs to know about it, but it's not really going to be the basis for their needs, their goals, their services. They might have some accommodations to help with that dyslexia, but it's really, what are the needs of your son? I think you said you had a son, right, Melissa?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yep. Okay, thank you. So what are the needs of your son? And if you feel that your son's needs are more related to their dyslexia, the specific learning disability of dyslexia, than other health impairment, then I would say it's not appropriate. I like to use the word appropriate over reasonable, because reasonable to me has like a wide berth of what you might think is reasonable and what I might think is reasonable. But I would say it's not really appropriate to not consider the dyslexia as well as the other health impairment. So, since you're here, Michael, feel free to ask a follow-up question if that wasn't helpful. But I think all of your son's needs need to be considered by his IEP team. And then based upon that severity, goals, services, and accommodations should be put into place.
Michael just added that his son's dyslexia is severe. And he says, does one category. I think he's going to finish that thought.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. But I wonder, changing the classification, I still wonder what the goals were and if any of that really changed in the change of the classification.
Yeah. And that's a good point, Melissa, because if your son does have severe dyslexia and didn't master all of his goals, let's say in his previous IEP, I'm just curious as to how the district kind of justified changing his eligibility category, right? Like, did they all of a sudden find him ineligible for specific learning disability? Or did they just say, we believe the other health impairment is the primary disability category, and we're going to make specific learning disability the secondary category?
Right. Well, Michael's follow-up question, the rest of it here is, does one category provide more services than another?
That's a really good question, Michael, and one that I would say is quite controversial in school districts, because some school districts will tell you that it does, and others will agree with me and say, no, as an IEP team, we have to look at all of the child's needs, from functional, academic, social, and emotional. So my answer is going to be, it shouldn't. And it just means that if your district has that position, it's going to be tougher to advocate for what your child needs if they've changed the eligibility classification, or if they're giving more weight to one over other. What we always teach parents is, if that's happening, if you have to bring something to the table more than just your request that it be done differently. You have to either provide the data or ask for the data from the school district to show why they should be more concerned with your son's dyslexia and his achievement gaps, and why he's not performing on grade level. And then the question really is, for the IEP team, what do you propose in terms of goals and services to help my son close these achievement gaps? And with kids with dyslexia, we're usually looking at phonemic awareness, decoding, encoding, fluency, all of those.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Back to the scope and sequence about OG interventions. Claudia asks, shouldn't there be a scope and sequence in any OG intervention?
Yes, absolutely. 100%, Claudia. There should be a scope and sequence for Orton-Gillingham intervention, whether it's a package program or something that the school district is using based on the OG methodology. They should be able to present parents with that scope and sequence.
Okay, so it's just a matter of asking your school team.
Yeah, I would say, to me, that would be a big red flag if I asked for a scope and sequence of the OG instruction and they couldn't produce one.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Tamara has a question. She says, if the schools have no interventions for high school students with learning disabilities, can parents recommend research or evidence-based intervention? And then what if the school says no?
Well, and that was Tamara. Thank you for being here tonight, Tamara. So first of all, I have to say that language I don't really receive that language, Tamara, because they have to have interventions in high school, right? And so I'm saying that kind of tongue in cheek to you, but if I was the advocate at the meeting and the high school team told me, well, we don't have any interventions to address a high school student's dyslexia, that would be denial of a free and appropriate public education. So we would have to figure out, what are we going to do to address your child's needs, even though they're in high school? And absolutely, you can, as a parent, propose, request, or suggest certain evidence-based Orton Gillingham interventions. And if I guess I'm just going to say if the district, really refused it, then you could offer to provide it. Maybe find a private provider. You could provide it to your child so they could receive FAPE, and you could even ask the district to, finance that service. So you could ask them to provide it at public expense. If they're telling you we have no way in our school district to meet your high school students' unique needs as they relate to dyslexia, you can say, well, okay, I will go and find that intervention, and I would like for the public school district to pay for that intervention.
What kind of interventions do you usually see in a high school level?
Yeah, that's a great question, Melissa. It really varies. Again, it's based upon the severity of the student. So there are some high school students, believe it or not, who are juniors reading on a second, third grade level. And those students really can't get the type of intervention that they need in a English class, a reading strategies class. They need very individualized, very targeted, often one-on-one multisensory structured literacy intervention. It's not easy to get, I will say that for those listening, but it's based upon the student's needs, right? It's usually based on years of a growing achievement gap that haven't been appropriately addressed. More often than not, we do see small group intervention happening through the high schools across the state of Virginia. There are different programs. I'm going to say that some are computerized, where there's a portion that's taught by directly and explicitly by teachers, and then there's some self-paced adaptive intervention that can happen. And it just depends, honestly. All of it should be based on what the student needs. And if you've been following us for a while, and I even said this today at the IEP meeting that I was in this afternoon, I turn to the front page and I say, individualized education plan has an I in it, because everything that happens for that child really should be individualized. And so what I would caution parents of high school students, if they're listening, is to ask deeper questions. If you're told, well, this is how we handle high school students with dyslexia, or if this is what we offer to high school students with dyslexia, maybe that's appropriate for your child and maybe it's not. It should all start with, what does the child need? What are their weaknesses? Right. How far behind are they? And as we were talking about, what's it going to take to close that gap? What's reasonable in the life of their IEP, one year, to expect meaningful progress?
As we're talking about high schoolers, I want to jump back to one of the questions that was sent to us, and Michael and Tamara have another follow-up. So I promise I will get to that, but I want to bring this one up now. This question is, I have an IEP meeting coming up for my 15-year-old son. He's been diagnosed with dyslexia and has been receiving reading services for years from his school. He's still reading 3 years below grade level. Is it worth fighting for more help at this point? Is there even enough time for him to catch up?
Well, I have to start by saying it is never too late. It is never too late to remediate anybody who has dyslexia. It is definitely easier when they are younger, just like with anything. Early identification is key, but it is never too late. I think when you're talking about a 15-year-old and they're, or I'm just going to say upper middle school, high school students, other factors should be considered by parents. And what I mean by that, Melissa, is it is a lot easier in elementary school to pull kids out, to give them specialized education services, right? When they're young and they're unaware and friends are unaware. As you get into the upper grade levels, you also want to consider as a family, what is the unintended consequence of my child getting, let's say, an hour a day of structured literacy intervention? Do they have to give up band? Do they have to give up, I don't know, graphic design or some kind of elective that they want to take because it's an area of interest for them? So I would consider, how is it going to be implemented? What is the intervention, as we just talked about, being proposed? Do you believe it will be effective for your child? But the intervention should be available at the high school level. And if you don't think it's going to take a toll on your child from a social and emotional perspective, because older students don't really like the stigmatization sometimes that goes along with being in a resource classroom or having to get special education instruction. There are many that are fine with it. They're, they own their dyslexia, they're strong self-advocates. But then there are others that this would be hard for them. So in that case, I advise families to consider a private tutor, right? That could help the child before or after school.
Yes. Yep. Great. Um, so Michael is asking another question. So remember,
Okay.
his child has an IEP and has severe dyslexia.
Yes, we did. I'm trying to make some notes here on some of these questions. Okay, I'm back with Michael. Go ahead.
Okay. So Michael says, what if I request an accommodation and it's denied? What can I do?
Okay. Can he give me an example of what is the accommodation? I think I could give him a better answer if I know what we're talking about.
Okay, let's give him a minute to
Sure.
do that. And in the meantime, I'll go ahead with Tamara's question.
Okay.
With regards to closing the achievement gap, my child's IEP team mentioned numerous times that my child will never close the achievement gap due to his diagnosis. How can a parent accept that?
Well, I don't know that you have to. I don't know what the diagnosis is. I'm not sure if it's dyslexia or something else, Tamara, but this is where, the opportunity to have an outside, private, individualized educational evaluation, an IEE, or I should say independent educational evaluation, an IEE, done by a private clinician can be super helpful for parents. And what I mean by that is if your child has been evaluated by the public school or been reevaluated by the public school, and you see a far and wide, achievement gap, and they're telling you, it's never going to close. If you disagree with the findings or the evaluation, what have you, from the district, you can consider getting an independent educational evaluation and an outside private clinical opinion. That to me sounds like something I would do if I was being told by the school that it's impossible to close this achievement gap. I would want someone else to look at my child's data, someone that I selected, to tell me what is reasonable, right? And we do often say it is not reasonable when you have a severe student with dyslexia to expect a 3, 4, 5-year gap to close in 1 year. But it is reasonable to expect your child to make at least 1 year's progress. And I'm going to say it has to be a little bit more than 1 year's progress because all their other classmates are making 1 year's progress, right?
Right.
So, we're striving for 1 year's progress to close that gap. But we, as parents, we want to make sure the goals are ambitious, but we do also want to keep in mind what is really possible with an appropriate intervention, what is an expected outcome, and maybe it's a year of growth, which would be great.
So you mentioned the IEE, the independent educational evaluation. So as long as your child has been evaluated by the county, you can request this?
Well, it is a little bit more complicated than that, Melissa. So
Okay.
we're in the state of Virginia. So it really has to do with what has the district evaluated. In the case of eligibility, most districts will do a psychological and an educational evaluation, and it really comes down to whether or not parents agree with the evaluation, right? If they disagree with the evaluation that the school district did for their child, they can request an independent educational evaluation at public expense. Now, without getting into all of the inner workings of an IEE, I think it's important for parents to keep in mind that school districts can say yes to that. They can say no to that. And they can even, in the most, unexpected cases, they could potentially file due process against the family and say, we believe that our evaluation is appropriate and that we did, what was asked of us. And so parents don't always know that can happen too, but it's something that should be considered. And, I will say, just for anyone listening, I really have not heard of a case where a district filed due process when a parent asked for an IE. But again, I'm not a special education attorney, and it is possible that could happen. So I just want to, share both sides of the coin.
Sure. Michael added to his question.
Yes.
He said, during his next annual IEP, I may request more one-on-one for classes that he struggles with, or maybe I could ask to increase his speech therapy sessions.
Okay, sure.
And what do I do if they say no to that?
Yes. So those are, in my mind, Michael, not really accommodations. What you're talking about are services. If you're asking for one-on-one, that's a more intensive service, some type of specialized instruction that's happening one-on-one. And same thing about the speech services. You're asking for an increase in services. And I'm going to come back to the point that I made earlier. You can certainly ask for that, but the decision should be made on data for your son. He has a son, right, Melissa? Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So, if you don't have a recent speech language evaluation done by the district or something done privately that the IEP team can look at to go, what are the speech language needs for your son? And because that's what they should be using to make a recommendation to you on appropriate services. And if, let's just say hypothetically, you have a district evaluation or a private evaluation that shows there's articulation issues, there's expressive language and receptive language issues, that your child needs a lot in the area of speech, and they're telling you they're going to give you 15 minutes once a week, I would say that's not appropriate based on the area of need. So as a parent, you want to be able to point to the data, ask for the data, so that you have the data to support your request. And it's not just you saying, I believe my son needs more speech. Parents are a lot more effective when they have the data or can request the district to get the assessment data to support or refute their request.
Lorraine, as you're talking, I just keep thinking about our online educational program. I have to bring it up. We've created an online educational program for parents called the Dyslexia Advocacy Advantage. And Lorraine keeps talking about gathering the data, making sure you have the right data and asking for more. And then most importantly, how do I interpret that data and understand, does that support the need for speech, or where do my child's needs really lie? And if you are interested in becoming a better parent advocate, I'm going to put a website up for you at the bottom here in a second.
I was just going to say, we can say it's primarily designed for parents who have children with dyslexia.
Right. Yeah. It is. That's an important part. Absolutely. But I just wanted to bring that up because, as you talk about parents having to understand this data, it's really a large part, not the only part of this program.
Sure. And I'll just say, we still offer private comprehensive advocacy services, but the course that Melissa is speaking about was really created out of my desire to help parents understand all of this, because you all are asking great questions tonight, and we appreciate that you need this information. So we tried to package it in a way that would be super helpful for parents.
And Stephanie asked me to say the name of the program again. It's called the Dyslexia Advocacy Advantage. And at the bottom of your screen, you can see our website, lorrainehightower.com/DAA. For Dyslexia Awareness Month, we're also running a special. So if you use that code, you can also get 50% off the program this month, which is an exciting deal. And so I'm going to get back to our questions here while that runs. Claudia has another question. She says, can the child study team propose LLD classroom over increase or change intervention?
Okay, LLD. I think she's talking about some type of learning disability classroom, Claudia, but just confirm that for me. Can they? And I'm going to need you to repeat it once we find out what LLD actually stands for.
Sure, absolutely. So Claudia, if you're still with us, we'd love to hear from you again.
If we don't hear from it, I still like the question, and I want to talk about it from like a learning disability classroom, because believe it or not, there are some school districts that use the term LD classroom. I've just not heard LLD, which is why I'm asking to double check.
Okay. Yeah, and it could be a typo too. Who knows?
Yes, that's true.
Okay, well, hopefully.
Well, go ahead and ask me the question, we're going to assume tonight, Claudia, that it has to do with a learning disability classroom.
I think that's it. She says yes.
Okay, good. So
okay, great. Thank you, Claudia. So here it is again. Can the child study team propose LD classroom over increase or change in intervention?
So of course, anything is possible when you're with the, the IEP team. They have the prerogative to make decisions that they believe are in the best interest of the child to provide a free and appropriate public education. But just hearing that question, we actually had a family that went through this recently that we kind of are helping them navigate. And, I would say that we're talking about a least restrictive environment situation here. And for those of you who have an IEP, you probably have what's called an LRE page, a least restrictive environment page. And so what I hear Claudia asking is, can they propose a more restrictive environment, a learning disability classroom, rather than, I think she said, over more intense services? And I would say, that as a parent, I would be asking the team to tell me more about the whole continuum of services that are supposed to be available in your child's least restrictive environment. Because in my opinion, that should be more of a last resort, putting a child in an extremely restrictive environment if they can have their needs met in a least restrictive environment with
Right.
more intensive or targeted or more individualized services.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Tamara had a question about our program, so I just want to answer this real quick.
Sure.
Can we pay only for the data and goals class? I think that's a great question. It's actually something that we've been talking about, right, Lorraine? Breaking it down into pieces and maybe doing that. But as of right now, this is an entire program all about creating an appropriate educational plan for a dyslexic child. It teaches you about it, about everything you need to know about gathering information and requesting data, interpreting data, goals, services, accommodations, progress monitoring, all geared to parents of children with dyslexia.
Yeah.
Michael has a follow-up question. He says, do I request additional testing or evaluations through his school or through the county?
Okay. So I think he's talking about as he's trying to get those increased services is what,
I think so.
what he's asking about. So it could be, so let me just say this, Michael, at any point in time, the IEP team can request additional evaluations to get data that they need to make decisions about the student, right, that they're considering. So you could, I don't know when your district last did like a comprehensive speech language evaluation. Technically, most school districts only want to do that every 3 years. So as we were talking about though earlier, let's just say, here we are in 2022 and your school district did a speech language evaluation in 2021. You could consider getting or requesting an independent educational evaluation and getting a private comprehensive speech language evaluation for a second opinion. So the first, I think he said, do I have to ask the school or the district? That is something that a lot of parents are confused about. But what I would encourage you to think about is when you're talking IEPs, you're really talking to the district and not the school, right? It's more of a district obligation. It's a federal obligation, actually. And so it's beyond the building that your child is in. So, but all requests should really start through the child's IEP team. So I know Michael said his child has an IEP. I would reconvene the team. I would share your concerns. I would provide real life examples of why you're concerned. I would provide your informal or formal data as a dad. I would ask for whatever district data might be possible to help guide decision-making around your son's classroom services and speech services.
As you're talking about kind of the steps that you go through, right? We start off with our school team. It reminds me of a piece of advice that you give often, which is elevate the conversation. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Melissa, because let's just say hypothetically, Michael does all of this, right? Mm-hmm. And he goes to the IEP meeting and they just kind of shut him down and they're like, nope, we're not doing any evaluations. Nope, we're not, we think your child's fine. First of all, I have to say that as a parent, you want to make sure that your request and agreement and denial of your request are being documented in the district's prior written notice document. Mm-hmm. And that is a document that the district, puts all of their decision-making on. It's actually required. And so they should actually be notating, what did the parent ask for? What was did they say yes or no? What was the rationale? What was the data they considered? What other factors were considered? So definitely make sure your request, your agreement and denial of those requests is documented on a prior written notice document. And then in addition to that, if you had a really unfortunate IEP experience, we say elevate the conversation all the time. Reach out to whether it's a special education supervisor in your district. Some districts have procedural support liaisons. Some districts, you just have to pick up the phone and call the Office of Procedural Support or Due Process to say, my IEP meeting did not go well. Because keep in mind, as parents, IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, says that parents are an equal member of that IEP team. So your request should be meaningfully considered. They shouldn't just be no. It should be something that is looked at further, and then your response to your request should be appropriately documented, and data consideration should be a big part of that.
Yeah. Okay. Claudia wants to talk a little bit more about aiming for at least a year worth of growth with intervention. And it reminds me of a graphic that we've used before where you have two people walking in a line and they're both walking at the same pace. And that person in the back can never catch up to that person in the front because they're both walking at the same pace. So can you talk a little bit more about why it's so important to have at least a year's worth of growth?
And this is something that as an advocate, I see almost weekly happen, where I'm at an IEP meeting, we're talking about progress, and the school, you know, again, this is not to say schools are not well-intentioned, but they're almost overly celebrating the child's progress compared to where the child was before. And they're forgetting the importance of comparing the child to their same age and grade level peers and really looking for that, what we call meaningful progress to close that achievement gap. So, you know, to answer Claudia's question about how to have at least 1 year's growth in her child's IEP, it all starts with determining the baseline. What is your child's baseline for each of the goals so that you know where they're starting? And then what is the target and what is the present level data telling you about where they are right now? And then as we were talking about, there are pacing guides for certain interventions. You know, I'll just throw out an example. If it's a child's, let's say, reading fluency goal, and they are in a intensive Orton Gillingham intervention, maybe it's extremely small group or one-on-one, we can expect that they're going to increase their fluency rate through effective and automatic decoding by somewhere between like 1.4 and 1.6 words per week. So we can actually calculate based on weeks of instruction, where do we think this child, if all things, go well, is going to be in terms of fluency at the end of that IEP. And that's true for other interventions as well. Now, it's not like a perfect calculation, but all things considered, we want to have a baseline, and then we want to ask the educational experts, given this baseline, what would 1 year's growth look like at a minimum? And how do we ensure that my child gets there? And that's when you start asking about, well, what's the intervention? Well, how many kids are in the class? How much explicit and direct instruction is my child going to get? And how will you progress monitor? And, you can ask what their training and background is. Some school teams don't like to answer that, but others are very transparent about their training. I've been pleasantly surprised where teachers tell me they've gone off on their own and done a lot of additional private training to be better teachers for kids with dyslexia. So that is great to hear. And if you don't ask, they may not tell you that. Right. So sometimes hearing that makes parents feel a little more comfortable. I will say at the same time, it does cause me pause when I hear that a teacher was like just trained. So, that's a situation where, depending upon the severity of the child, is that an appropriate instructional match? Maybe, maybe not.
Right. Those are tough questions to ask, I think, sometimes for parents. They have a relationship with the teacher. They don't want to upset anyone. And I think that is when it is, one of many times when it's really great to have an advocate on board who can work collaboratively. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
No, I was going to say, you do bring up a really good point, and I will share that many families say, that they are concerned about their long-term relationship with the school district, and they really don't want to be, that parent that is making these big demands. And I would say that is where, an advocate can, slide in and help the family in a professional but assertive way get answers to their questions, and we do that, for a lot of families.
And to know the questions to ask, because
Right.
it's great to hear you, Lorraine, and you just throw out all the questions that you know to ask. And I hope that people are out there taking notes, because you know the right questions to ask to get the answers, and then the follow-up questions for that. And that kind of brings us to Claudia's next question.
Okay.
How do you debate this situation? There was no fluency goal for her child, even with 2 years of OG instruction. So how can she approach that with her school team?
Sure. So, and it is really hard for me, Claudia, to give individualized feedback when I don't have any data, any files, anything, not even an IEP for your child. But I'm going to try to answer the question of how do I don't really think of it as debating. I'm seeking to understand why the IEP team is making the decision that they are making. And then as an advocate or as a parent, I would say what you're really hoping to do is bring forth the data for a different outcome from that decision if you believe one is warranted. Mm-hmm. So I don't recommend that parents get into debates or verbal arguments with school teams. I think that really can negatively impact relationships, because 9 times out of 10, it's not personal. It's that the staff member really believes, or they've been told, this is how we do things, and they don't always know how to connect the dots between what you're asking for and what they think they can provide or should provide. So at some point, Melissa, as we wrap up, we should talk about dispute resolution options for parents. Maybe put that in the parking lot. But okay. In terms of, I don't know if I've addressed your question. I want to make sure I hit it. So give it to me again. I think it was, how do I debate a request or something like that?
For no fluency goal, even though there's been 2 years of OG instruction.
Okay, so, and this answer may surprise Claudia, sometimes a fluency goal is appropriate and sometimes it's not. And what I mean by that is in the most severe and profound cases of dyslexia, where a student doesn't even know their sounds and letters, they don't have any sound letter correspondence, it would be, I think, harmful to ask that student to try to decode automatically at a pace that's going to allow them to comprehend, which is what true fluency really is. You're decoding automatically at a rate that is allowing for accurate comprehension. So we have to look at each deficit with the child and what should we be putting in the IEP. Carrying through with that example, if we have a very severe and profoundly dyslexic student, we might need to spend we're building up letter sound knowledge, phonemic awareness activities, basic decoding. And then maybe the next year or the year after that, we're really focusing on fluency. And fluency can also look different. You can have a fluency goal where the student is just reading in controlled text of the syllable types that they've mastered, or you can have a fluency goal where a student is reading a grade level passage, as we said, at an expected rate and even able to answer comprehension questions accurately. So fluency goals can and should be considered differently for every child.
So individualized.
Yes.
It's so individualized. Thank you. That was a great answer.
Yeah,
I have another question here from someone who sent their question in earlier. Okay. She says, we got an evaluation from a private provider that shows my child has dyslexia, dysgraphia, and ADHD. She is also off the charts high in visual spatial processing. The school has said that even though she has all those diagnoses, she doesn't qualify for special education. How can that be?
Okay, so I think I'm trying to think of how I want to answer this. Well, let me just start by saying when teams are considering special education eligibility, it is a two-pronged decision, right? So does the team believe the child has a disability? And when I'm talking right now, Melissa, about IDEA, do they have like a disorder or a disability that is resulting in underachievement, that's connected to a processing disorder, that is having really an adverse impact on them in the classroom that requires special education instruction? So that's like one prong of the decision, right? If they're considering eligibility for what's called a Section 504 plan, they're really looking at what is the diagnosed disability that affects a major life activity like reading or spelling, and how substantially restricted is the student in trying to access and make progress in the grade level curriculum. So from that,
That's really important, Lorraine. I want to just stop for a second because I don't think parents always realize that special education, spoken about broadly, can take two different forms with the IEP and the 504 plan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely can. I mean, these are different regulations, right? One is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and the other is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So two separate criteria for special education services and supports. With Section 504 plans, it can include services, but typically parents think of that as an accommodation plan, whereas the IEP is more of remediation services and accommodations, right?
Okay.
But I think that I need a little bit. Can you go back and give me some of the details? Because she said it wasn't found eligible.
Not found eligible for special education, but did have a private evaluation.
Right. Okay.
Yep. Dyslexia, dysgraphia, and ADHD, and off the charts high in visual spatial processing.
Right. So that tells me, I mean, again, we don't have this child's information or data, but what I see often as an advocate, you can have children who have all of these disabilities, but if they are gifted or gifted in some ways, they could actually be what's called a twice exceptional student, right? They have a really high IQ, but they have a significant discrepancy in some of their maybe other processing abilities or in academic deficits. And I can think of one student that we recently helped who was definitely gifted, very high full scale IQ, like in the 99th percentile, and yet had dysgraphia. So spelling and written expression were below the 5th percentile. I mean, this is multiple standard deviations of a discrepancy. And yet that student really didn't need an IEP or specially designed instruction so much as he needed and wanted the accommodation of being able to use speech to text, because when he could use speech to text, his writing was on grade level, and he really didn't want to have private remediation services through the public school system. So that was a case where the Section 504 plan more than met his needs, allowed him to show what he knew, in spite of being substantially restricted by his disability. Yeah. I hope that makes sense, Melissa.
It does. Okay. It does. And so back to her question of, how can it be that you can have diagnoses but not qualify? You started talking a little bit about the two-pronged decision. One being, the diagnosis, but
the other is the adverse impact.
More about the other.
The adverse impact that the diagnosis is having on the student. So when you're looking at IDEA, you're really looking at underachievement. And when you're looking at 504, you're looking at how substantially restricted they are due to a major life activity that has a disability around it.
Okay.
Yeah. I want to say though, Melissa, because I don't want to give the impression that all 2E kids or twice exceptional kids can only get a 504 plan. We actually help quite a few students who are twice exceptional. They have IEPs. They need IEPs because they meet the criteria for the IEP, even though they're gifted. Their reading might have an adverse impact on their ability to make progress in the grade level curriculum, and therefore they do require specially designed instruction. And I hate to keep coming back to that's why this has to be individualized, but it really should be.
It really is. Yeah. I added our website down at the bottom below, Lorraine, because I know that we are in the works of creating a seminar and a free webinar about eligibility, where we really dive into this with the adverse impact and 504s and IEPs. So if you haven't either downloaded one of our resources or joined our subscribe to our newsletter, joined our website, I highly recommend you do so that way you're in the loop and you know when these things come out in January. So if you're interested in eligibility.
I was going to say that's kind of a passion project of mine is we get the most calls and inquiries around eligibility and a lot of the confusion that exists for parents. So we are going to be doing a workshop on that in the new year.
And I see Stephanie here. She's live with us tonight, and she has a question. And I'm going to leave the website with the resources page up while I ask this, because she's going to ask about signs of dyslexia. And I just want to throw out there before I even get to this question that we have a wonderful resource called The Top 10 Signs of Dyslexia That Parents Often Miss. So if you haven't subscribed, when you download that resource, that will subscribe you to our newsletter, and you'll have everything you need. So I'll just leave that up, and I'll get to Stephanie's question. So if a 6-year-old is having difficulty matching letter and sound recognition, would that be a sign of potential dyslexia? He has an IEP for speech, but academically, he's having difficulty learning letters versus numbers, pairing sounds with letters, and identifying letters consistently.
Yes. I don't know exactly what the age is at preschool. Did she say preschool?
6-year-old.
Is that preschool, Melissa? You were a teacher.
No, that would be like kindergarten, first grade.
Oh, wow. Okay. So not preschool. So yes, I would, again, you have to consider everything for your child. And we're just hearing a couple of examples, but definitely not knowing which sounds go with which letters. If you see reversals of letters and numbers kind of beyond the developmentally appropriate age, which is often, towards the end of first grade. Another thing that, Stephanie, I know I saw this with my own son, many parents see this, is not able to repeat multisyllabic words. Like kids will say Paschetti instead of spaghetti. My son used to say York instead of New York, or specific instead of Pacific. I mean, those are some big words for early elementary school, but they have, they can't often write their own name, or they start to, try to phonetically spell their own name. Some kids hold a book upside down, meaning they don't even understand the letter orientation, right? There's so many signs. Not being able to memorize the ABC song or sing that back is another early indicator, because dyslexia is a language processing disability. So it can often cause like delayed speech, or what looks like delayed speech, when it could be speech, right? But it could be dyslexia just at the very earliest of stages. Yeah. I hope that's helpful. What we see in kids in elementary, and I hope this doesn't happen for your child, is they start off curious learners. They love going to school. They're so excited their friends are there. And then as they're introduced to certain academic tasks that they just can't do, and that could even be writing the letters on the paper, right? They're just have no idea how to write them, where they should go. Their letters are above the baseline. All of these, there's so many red flags. And I think, Melissa, as you said, we have a special document on what we feel are some of the important signs. It can be a lot of things, but I think we can't overemphasize enough to parents not to wait. If you have these concerns, I would tell you to make a referral to the school district and say, I have these concerns. They should be looked at, because the special education eligibility process takes a long time. And many parents don't realize that it can take up to 65 business days to get a socio-cultural, psychological, and educational evaluation, which a school district will want to do as part of the eligibility process. So too often we do hear from parents who say, I just knew it in my gut that something wasn't right, but I kept waiting and hoping that things were going to improve. And often you lose half a school year by waiting and hoping. So it's, I would also say to Stephanie, what is the teacher seeing? That's always my first go-to. Talk to your child's teacher. You're their best advocate because you're the parent, you're seeing them at home, but also engage with the teacher and ask, how does your child look compared to their same age and grade level peers? What do they appear to be struggling with in the classroom? Some teachers, without telling parents, will actually do some response to intervention, which is often referred to as RTI. They'll start doing some small group specialized instruction. Please keep in mind, I'm not saying that providing RTI to a student is an acceptable reason to delay an evaluation. Definitely not saying that. I don't want to say that. But I'm saying a teacher might be doing some RTI, and it would be good to know that if you are thinking that your child does need to be evaluated for suspected disabilities. So definitely talk to the teacher and take action would be my recommendation.
Yeah. And we talk about often that students learn to read or are taught to read in grades 1 through 3. And then they have to read in order to learn beyond that. And oftentimes that's when we see the children fall further and further behind their peers. So if we can get those appropriate remediation and interventions in place prior to 3rd grade, your child is in a much better place to make progress moving forward.
And Melissa, I just have to add on to that's a great comment, of course. Thank you for saying it. As a teacher, you know that best. But I have to say, one of the concerns that's happening right now in all of our school districts in Virginia is that we haven't had appropriate early literacy curriculums in grades
Yes.
1 through 3. Across the state of Virginia, all of the school districts are having to reconsider their early literacy curriculums. So why is that important, right? If you suspect disabilities, it's really important because, one, we know that the general education literacy curriculum hasn't been effective. We're hoping that's going to soon change. But it's more important to identify the disability of dyslexia so that they can start to be found eligible and get more of an evidence-based intervention to help close that gap.
Absolutely. That goes back to a comment Claudia made as well. She talked about, remember, she was the person who asked about the fluency goals.
Yes, I do.
So Claudia mentioned that there's no fluency goals, but his Fountas and Pinnell level keeps improving slowly. So as you're talking about programs and things that are evidence-based to work, that made me think of her comment as well.
Yeah.
If you have anything else to add.
Yeah, so she's saying there's no program, but his Fountas and Pinnell, I think his oral reading fluency, it sounds like the district is tracking his oral reading fluency from Fountas and Pinnell benchmark, and that is slowly increasing. My recommendation is to find out what is the grade level benchmark. Where should your child be fall, winter, and spring? And it's great that it's slowly increasing, but is it on pace, right? Is it really lagging behind? And to your point, they really do need to consider additional services to help increase that fluency.
Okay. All right. Well, it is 8:01. So Lorraine, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you all for your wonderful questions. It's been a great evening of conversation. If you guys, have any other questions, please do log on to our website, contact us, message us through Facebook. We're here. And we would love to talk to you. And Lorraine is also available to book discovery calls if you feel like you could, use someone to talk to talk about how Lorraine may be able to help you with her advocacy services. I'm sorry, Lorraine, go ahead.
No, I got all excited. I didn't mean to talk over you, but one of the things
I went off on a little tangent there. Go ahead.
Totally fine. One of the things that we offered in honor of Dyslexia Awareness Month is we sent out letters to all of the local school districts and offered to come in and do, a parent training or invite school staff on best ways to accommodate kids with dyslexia in the classroom. And again, this is not something that we do throughout the year because we're usually very busy serving our private advocacy clients, but we have a couple more days left in October. So if you want to talk to your school administration or your school PTA, the Parent Teacher Association, we have had a few schools take us up on the offer. It's a complimentary offer to come in and educate, create awareness, and inform about the unique needs of kids with dyslexia. So we'd love to do that too.
Yep, that was a great point. Thanks, Lorraine. All right, thank you all, and we'll see you next time on Ask the Advocate Live. Good night,
everybody. Good night.